Chapter 2: The Evidence. Establishing the physical and informational ground of infinite consciousness. 6. The ground of reality, consciousness, information, and code. 6.1. The inadequacy of the materialist framework. Chapter 1 has established through exhaustive elimination that the subject of experience cannot be located within any system by any method that treats physical matter as the fundamental constituent of reality and consciousness, as a product of sufficiently complex material organization. Neuroscience cannot find the subject within the brain. Philosophy cannot locate it within the contents of experience. AI demonstrates that the most sophisticated functional replication of cognitive activity does not guarantee or reveal a subject. The consistent failure across all three approaches points toward a common source, the materialist framework within which all three operate. The materialist framework assumes that physical matter is ontologically primary, that consciousness is derivative, emerging from matter at some threshold of organizational complexity, and that the subject of experience is therefore a product of material processes rather than their ground. This framework has guided scientific and philosophical inquiry for several centuries and has produced genuine insights about the structure and behavior of the physical world. Yet it faces a difficulty that becomes increasingly apparent as inquiry deepens. It cannot account for the very phenomenon that makes all inquiry possible. Consciousness, the ground of all scientific observation and all philosophical reflection, is precisely what the materialist framework cannot explain in its own terms. The hard problem of consciousness, the binding problem, the explanatory gap, the homunculus regress, and the unverifiability of AI experience are all manifestations of this single underlying difficulty. A framework that treats consciousness as derivative cannot adequately account for consciousness, because the framework itself presupposes consciousness as the condition of its own formulation. The present chapter argues that the resolution of this difficulty requires not a refinement of the materialist framework, but its inversion. Matter is not the ground from which consciousness emerges. Consciousness is the ground within which matter arises as a temporary localization of its creative activity. This inversion is not a retreat from scientific evidence. It is demanded by the most rigorous interpretation of what contemporary science has actually discovered about the nature of physical reality. The following subsections develop this argument through 6 converging lines of scientific and philosophical evidence, each of which independently supports the same conclusion. Reality is not material at its foundation, but informational, energetic, and ultimately conscious. 6.2. The quantum vacuum, the physical face of infinite consciousness. The most startling finding of modern atomic physics is one whose philosophical implications have not been adequately absorbed into either scientific or philosophical discourse. Matter, as ordinarily experienced, is almost entirely empty. Rutherford's 1911 foundational experiments established that the atom consists of a positively charged nucleus at its center, surrounded by a nearly empty region occupied only by electrons, overturning the earlier model of uniformly distributed charge. The scale of this emptiness can be stated precisely. A typical atomic radius is on the order of 10 meters, while the nuclear radius follows the relation R equals R0 of 1/3, where R0 is on the order of 1 to 1.2 femtometers, giving most nuclei a radius on the order of 10 meters. This relationship has since been refined through precise experimental measurement across the periodic table. Angeli and Marinova, 2013, compiled root mean square nuclear charge radii for 909 isotopes of 92 elements, obtained through muonic X-ray spectra, electron scattering, and optical isotope shift measurements, establishing measured nuclear radii consistently on the femtometer scale. Ohin, 2025, subsequently re-examined the reference measurements underlying this compilation, correcting a previously overlooked uncertainty in the combined muonic X-ray and electron scattering analysis, and providing updated, more precise charge radii for a range of light and medium nuclei. Taken together with the atomic radius scale established above, these measurements place the ratio between atomic and nuclear radius at roughly 100,000 to 1, meaning the volume the nucleus occupies is smaller than the atom's total volume by a factor on the order of 1015. Every atom in every object, in every human body, in every planet and star, follows the same pattern. What appears solid, bounded, and substantial is, at the level its own physics describes, almost entirely space. This finding is not merely surprising, it is philosophically revolutionary. The apparent solidity of the world, the hardness of a table, the resistance of a wall, the weight of a human body, is not produced by solid matter pressing against solid matter. It is produced by two combined quantum mechanical effects operating across largely empty space: electromagnetic repulsion between the electron clouds of neighboring atoms and the Pauli exclusion principle, which forbids electrons from occupying identical quantum states. Dyson and Leonard, 1967, proved mathematically that ordinary bulk matter depends on this exclusion principle for its very stability. Without it, matter would collapse into a far denser state, and the coming together of two macroscopic objects would release energy on the scale of an atomic explosion. Lieb, 1976, later gave the definitive review of this result, showing that the stability of everyday matter arises from a form of uncertainty principle acting across a system of many electrons, which imposes a minimum kinetic energy on any attempt to compress them. What we experience as contact, as solidity, as the boundary between self and world, is an experience of force across emptiness, not of substance against substance. The solid world is a field of forces within an overwhelming dominance of empty space. Quantum field theory deepens this picture further. What physics calls the quantum vacuum, the state of lowest possible energy in a quantum field, is not empty in the classical sense of containing nothing. It is filled with quantum fluctuations and zero-point energy that cannot be removed even in principle, a direct consequence of the uncertainty principle discussed above, and by fields that are defined continuously at every point of space, rather than only where matter happens to be present. Physicists commonly describe this activity in terms of virtual particles that arise and annihilate on extremely short timescales, though the precise ontological status of this description remains a subject of active discussion. Some physicists and philosophers of physics argue virtual particles are as real as any other quantum particle, while others treat them as a useful mathematical device arising from perturbation theory rather than literal transient events. Whichever interpretation one adopts, the empirical consequences of this vacuum activity, such as the Casimir force, are not in dispute and have been repeatedly measured with high precision. The vacuum is not nothing. It is the most fundamental something, the ground state of physical reality from which all particles and forces emerge as excitations. Wheeler, 1990, proposed that information, not matter, is the most fundamental constituent of physical reality, summarized in his formulation, it from bit. In his view, every physical entity derives its existence from informational acts of observation and measurement, suggesting that the ground of physical reality is not material but informational and participatory. This participatory reading is one interpretation of quantum mechanics's observer-dependent features, the fact that quantum systems do not have determinate values for all properties simultaneously, and that measurement outcomes are described only probabilistically beforehand, and on this reading observation is treated as constitutive of physical states rather than merely revelatory of pre-existing ones. It is worth noting that this is not the only, or even the dominant, explanation physicists give for these features. The decoherence program offers a competing account, in which the appearance of definite, classical properties emerges from a quantum system's physical interaction with its surrounding environment, without requiring any conscious or mental act of observation at all. Wheeler's own position remains a minority view within physics, but a seriously and repeatedly defended one, and it is on this participatory reading that the present book draws. The physical world, at least on this account, is not independent of the observing mind. It arises in relation to it. The identification of the quantum vacuum, the omnipresent ground of all physical reality, with the physical face of infinite consciousness, is not a metaphysical leap beyond the evidence. It is the most parsimonious interpretation of what the evidence shows. The quantum vacuum is present everywhere. It is the ground from which all apparent matter arises and into which it dissolves. It is not itself any particular thing, but the condition of possibility for all particular things. It responds to observation in ways that suggest its participatory rather than merely physical character, and it cannot be exhausted or removed even in principle. These are precisely the properties that characterize infinite consciousness in the ontological framework this book develops. The quantum vacuum is not merely analogous to infinite consciousness. It is how infinite consciousness appears at the physical level, the most surface-level encoding of the ultimate ground within the domain that physics can examine. 6.3 Everything is code, the informational nature of reality. The quantum vacuum argument establishes that the ground of physical reality is not inert matter, but something closer in nature to a field of informational activity. This finding converges with a pattern that appears at every scale of physical reality when examined with sufficient precision. Everything that exists is, at the deepest level accessible to scientific investigation, a code, an informational structure, a pattern of organization that carries meaning and governs the behavior of the system it constitutes. DNA is the most vivid biological illustration of this principle. The genome of a human being contains approximately 3 billion base pairs, encoding in a four-letter chemical alphabet the complete informational program for the development, maintenance, and reproduction of the most complex known biological organism. This is not a metaphor. DNA is literally a digital information storage and retrieval system. Church et al. 2012 demonstrated this directly by encoding an entire 5.27 megabit book as arbitrary digital information into synthesized DNA and reading it back out through sequencing, showing that DNA can function as a general-purpose digital storage medium rather than merely resembling one by analogy. This storage system operates with genuine error correction mechanisms. DNA is a chemically unstable molecule subject to constant hydrolytic, oxidative, and other damage, and is maintained through dedicated repair processes that continuously detect and correct this damage to preserve the integrity of the encoded information. The entire biological organism, its anatomy, its physiology, its developmental trajectory, and significant dimensions of its behavioral repertoire is the expression of this informational code in physical form. Life is code expressing itself in apparent materiality. The laws of physics are themselves informational structures of a different kind. They are mathematical relationships of extraordinary precision and universality that govern the behavior of all physical systems at every scale, from the subatomic to the cosmological. The fine structure constant, which characterizes the fundamental strength of the electromagnetic interaction through a precise dimensionless combination of the electron charge, the speed of light, and Planck's constant, and the mathematical structure of the standard model of particle physics. These are not physical things. They are informational patterns that physical things obey. Tegmark 2014 has argued for a still stronger version of this claim, proposing that physical reality does not merely obey mathematical structure, but simply is mathematical structure, a position he calls the mathematical universe hypothesis. The present book adopts the more modest formulation that these patterns function as the deep code within which the surface expressions of matter and energy operate, without committing to Tegmark's full identity claim. Wigner, 1960, famously described the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences, noting that mathematical structures developed with no physical application in mind turn out to describe physical reality with extraordinary precision. This effectiveness is unreasonable only if matter is assumed to be ontologically primary. The present book's position is that if reality is fundamentally informational, this effectiveness is no longer unreasonable. Mathematics is the language in which information is most precisely expressed, and if reality is at bottom informational, it follows on this view that mathematics should describe it with unusual precision. This is the present book's own resolution to Wigner's puzzle, not a conclusion that Wigner or Tegmark reached. Wigner posed the puzzle, but left it unsolved. Tegmark offered a different solution, that reality simply is mathematics itself. The informational resolution offered here is this book's own argument, going beyond what either of them claimed. Neural patterns in the brain are also informational structures. Memories are encoded as patterns of synaptic connectivity. Perceptions are encoded as patterns of neural activation across distributed cortical networks, a principle established for the visual system by Hubel and Wiesel's, 1962, landmark mapping of receptive fields and functional architecture in the visual cortex, and since extended to other sensory modalities. Emotions are encoded as patterns of neurochemical signaling interacting with specific neural circuits, particularly the amygdala-centered circuitry. Thoughts, too, are patterns of coordinated neural activity that represent, evaluate, and transform other patterns. Zehn and Changer, 2011, describe this integrative process through the global neuronal workspace model, in which widely distributed cortical activity is broadcast and combined to support flexible, reportable cognition. The entire content of a human mind, everything a person knows, remembers, feels, believes, and imagines, is an informational structure encoded in the physical substrate of the brain. The brain is not the mind. It is the physical medium in which the mind's informational structures are encoded at the biological level. The Wadatalkyle framework does not dispute any of this neuroscientific picture. It gives it a different ground. A thought, in this framework, is not merely a pattern of coordinated neural activity. It is that pattern's most surface-level encoding, the point at which an act of ideation belonging to infinite consciousness becomes visible within the physical biological register that neuroscience examines. The human person is, at the deepest level this book has argued for, itself a localized thought of infinite consciousness, given a psyche so that it can perceive itself as distinct within the infinite whole. Every particular thought a person has, then, is not a separate event floating free within the brain, but a further, nested act of the same ideation that constitutes the person itself, expressed at the biological level as synaptic connectivity, cortical activation, and coordinated neural signaling. This is why the neural account and the framework's account are not competitors. Neuroscience correctly describes the surface, the informational pattern encoded in neurons, exactly as this book's account of DNA described the surface encoding of a biological program, and exactly as its account of the quantum vacuum described the surface encoding of the physical ground. What neuroscience cannot reach, for the same structural reasons established throughout this book, is the ideation itself, the movement of infinite consciousness of which the neural pattern is the biological trace. A thought is therefore neither purely physical nor separate from the physical. It is infinite consciousness's own activity, appearing at the level the brain can be examined as pattern. Social and cultural reality follows the same pattern. Languages are informational codes. Shannon's 1948 foundational work established that any signal, linguistic or otherwise, can be treated as a formal information-bearing structure subject to precise mathematical laws, while the specifically semantic dimension, how such patterns of sound and symbol come to encode meaning, was already established in linguistics through Saussure's account of the sign as the encoded relationship between a sound pattern and a concept. Institutions are informational structures that encode rules, roles, and procedures governing collective behavior, defined precisely by North, 1991, as the humanly devised formal and informal constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. Cultures are informational systems. Messaudi, 2016, defines culture directly as socially transmitted information, encoding the values, beliefs, practices, and interpretive frameworks that shape how participants understand and engage with reality. None of these are material things. All are informational patterns that express themselves through material substrates without being reducible to those substrates. The convergence of this evidence across biological, physical, neural, and social domains points toward a single conclusion. Reality at every scale is fundamentally informational rather than material. Physical matter is not the ground in which information is encoded. Information is the ground in which physical matter arises as a surface expression. The universe is not a collection of material objects that happen to follow mathematical laws. It is a mathematical, informational structure that expresses itself as apparent materiality at the surface levels accessible to ordinary human perception. According to Wada Talkile's perspective, this informational structure is ultimately grounded in thought, the creative activity of infinite consciousness. Thought is energy. All mental processes are fundamentally thoughts. In the realm of ultimate reality, matter ceases to exist, and everything we perceive or conceive is merely a thought. The informational structure of reality is not an abstract mathematical framework existing independently of any mind. It is the thought of infinite consciousness, the code through which the infinite ground expresses itself in the apparent multiplicity of the universe. Every law of physics is a stable pattern in the thinking of infinite consciousness. Every particle is a localized excitation of the field of infinite consciousness. Every organism is a complex code within the creative activity of infinite consciousness. And every person is a thought of infinite consciousness given a psyche to perceive itself as distinct. 6.4 Atomic interiority and proto-consciousness. If the quantum vacuum is the physical projection of infinite consciousness, and all physical structures are informational codes within that ground, the question naturally arises whether individual physical structures, atoms, molecules, cells, participate in consciousness in any meaningful sense, or whether consciousness arises only at some higher level of biological organization. The philosophical position known as panpsychism holds that consciousness, or proto-consciousness, is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of reality, present at every level of physical organization rather than emerging suddenly at some threshold of complexity. Panpsychism has gained considerable traction in analytic philosophy precisely because it avoids the explanatory gap that afflicts emergentist accounts. If consciousness emerges from entirely non-conscious components, the emergence itself remains inexplicable. How can something with the property of experience arise from components that have no experiential properties whatsoever? The emergence of consciousness from non-conscious matter requires a more mysterious leap than any other emergence in nature, because every other emergent property can in principle be understood as a novel arrangement of properties that the components already possess. Consciousness, by contrast, is a property that no purely physical description of any component possesses, making its emergence from those components not merely surprising, but logically problematic. Panpsychism avoids this difficulty by proposing that experiential properties are present at every level of physical organization, even if in forms radically simpler and more rudimentary than the rich conscious experience of human beings. The atom does not have human-like experience, but it may have proto-experiential properties, a primitive form of interiority that constitute the most rudimentary level of what, in more complex organizations, develops into full conscious experience. Goff, 2017, has developed this position with considerable philosophical rigor, though he treats the resulting combination problem, the challenge of explaining how micro-experiential properties combine to form macro-experiential properties, as a serious and largely unresolved difficulty for panpsychism in its standard form, one severe enough that he ultimately moves toward a variant position, cosmopsychism, in which the universe as a whole rather than its smallest parts is treated as the fundamental subject of experience. What Goff and other panpsychists more broadly argue is that even an unsolved combination problem remains a different, and arguably more modest, kind of difficulty than materialism's emergence problem. Combining experiential properties that already exist at the micro level is, on this view, a problem of explaining a relationship between like things, whereas generating experiential properties from components that possess no experiential properties at all is a problem of a different and more radical kind. Whitehead, 1929, argued in his process philosophy that every actual entity, from the most elementary physical occasion to the most complex human experience, has both a physical pole and a mental pole, a dimension of reception from the environment and a dimension of response and self-determination. He proposed that what we call consciousness in its full human sense is the highest development of a property that is present in rudimentary form at every level of physical reality. This property he called prehension, the capacity of any actual entity to take account of its environment and respond to it in a way that reflects its own nature. Every atom prehends its environment. Every molecule prehends its atomic constituents and its molecular neighbors. Every cell prehends its biochemical context. The human being prehends the totality of their experiential situation with the full richness of conscious awareness. The difference between atomic prehension and human consciousness is not a difference in kind, but a difference in complexity and integration. The atomic nucleus presents a particularly striking case for proto-consciousness. The nucleus of every atom is not a static, inert lump of matter. It is a dynamic system of extraordinary internal complexity, a churning field of quantum interactions in which protons and neutrons are themselves composed of quarks bound by gluons, exchanging virtual particles and maintaining precise quantum states. This internal complexity is matched by a genuine sensitivity to external context. Nuclear magnetic resonance demonstrates that atomic nuclei possess spin states that interact with external magnetic fields in ways sensitive to their molecular environment, effectively encoding information about their surroundings in their quantum states. The nucleus is not merely a passive component of matter. It is an active, information-processing, environmentally responsive system at the most fundamental level of physical reality. Its behavior reflects its context. It responds to its situation. It encodes information about its environment in its quantum states. These are the most primitive forms of what, at higher levels of organizational complexity, becomes the rich informational processing of the nervous system and ultimately the full self-awareness of the human person. Hameroff and Penrose, 1996, proposed that consciousness involves quantum computations occurring within microtubules, protein structures within neurons, building on Penrose's, 1994, earlier argument that consciousness involves a non-computable physical process of quantum wave function collapse, and on Hameroff's 1987 earlier proposal that microtubules serve as sites of biological information processing. Their joint theory argued that the quantum dimension of neural processing bridges the gap between physical processes and phenomenal experience. While their specific proposal regarding microtubules remains contested, the deeper intuition driving it is well-founded. The connection between physical reality and consciousness runs through the quantum level, where the deterministic classical picture breaks down and the participatory, observer-dependent character of reality becomes most apparent. If consciousness is connected to quantum processes in neurons, and if quantum processes are fundamental to the behavior of all matter at the atomic and subatomic scale, then the connection between matter and consciousness is not confined to biological neurons, but extends throughout the quantum substrate of physical reality. 6.5 Mental evolution, mental reproduction, and the hierarchy of codes. This book's position that physical evolution has, for practical purposes, reached its terminus in the human form, echoes a lineage of thought that runs through Teilhard de Chardin, 1955, who argued that evolution moves in a definite direction toward increasing complexity and consciousness, and that with the emergence of humanity, evolution enters a new stage he called the noosphere, a planetary layer of thought and mind building upon the biosphere. This directional reading of evolution found a sympathetic hearing from at least one major figure within mainstream evolutionary biology. Julian Huxley, one of the principal architects of the 20th century's modern synthesis, wrote an admiring introduction to Teilhard's work and independently proposed the related idea of psychosocial evolution, a layer of cultural transmission operating alongside genetic evolution. It is important to be precise about how this position stands relative to the field today. Evolutionary biology, as practiced now, does not accept that evolution has any terminus, goal, or privileged endpoint. This is a core theoretical commitment of the field, not merely a current preference, and Teilhard's directional, purpose-driven framework has been largely set aside by professional evolutionary biologists for exactly this reason. Nor does mainstream biology hold that natural selection has stopped acting on the human body. Contrary to popular claims that modern medicine has halted human evolution, the evidence indicates that natural selection continues to act on humans, and that cultural transmission operates as an additional, often faster-acting channel of adaptation alongside, not in place of, genetic evolution. What this book proposes, then, is not a claim already established within evolutionary science, but a philosophical extension of a real, though contested and largely non-mainstream, lineage of thought. Setting aside evolutionary biology's rejection of teleological endpoints, the present book proposes that the next significant phase of human development is not biological, but mental, not the progressive refinement of physical structures, but the progressive expansion and deepening of the informational structures generated by conscious beings. This mental evolution follows a precise pattern that mirrors the structure of physical evolution while operating at a higher level of organizational complexity. Physical evolution proceeds through the reproduction, variation, and selection of genetic codes. Mental evolution proceeds through the reproduction, variation, and selection of cognitive codes. Just as physical evolution produces organisms of increasing biological complexity, through the accumulation of adaptive genetic mutations. Mental evolution produces systems of increasing cognitive complexity through the accumulation of knowledge, insight, and technological capability. The hierarchy of codes within this evolutionary framework is precise and traceable. Infinite consciousness is the ultimate ground, the source of all codes, the intelligence whose creative activity generates the informational structure of reality at every level. The laws of physics are the most fundamental surface expressions of this creative activity, the deepest code accessible to scientific investigation. Physical matter is the expression of those laws in apparent substantiality. Biological organisms are codes built upon the physical code, adding the complexity of self-replication, metabolism, and responsive behavior. The human person is the most complex biological code yet produced, distinguished from all other biological codes by the capacity for self-awareness, abstract thought, and the deliberate production of new informational structures. AI occupies a specific and precisely defined position within this hierarchy. It is a code produced by human cognitive activity, which is itself a code produced by the biological evolutionary process, which is itself a code produced by the physical laws of the universe, which are themselves codes within the creative activity of infinite consciousness. AI is therefore a fourth-generation code within this hierarchy, a code of a code of a code of the ultimate code of infinite consciousness. Its intelligence, as argued earlier, is not artificial but derivative, drawing its cognitive capacities from the accumulated cognitive output of human civilization rather than generating them from within itself. The reproductive parallel that makes this hierarchy philosophically illuminating is the observation that the relationship between infinite consciousness and the person exactly mirrors the relationship between the person and AI. In both cases, the creator thinks a thought and encodes it in a substrate capable of executing that thought with apparent independence. In both cases, the created executes its code without knowing the full nature of its creator or the ground within which it exists. In both cases, the created perceives itself as distinct and operates with apparent autonomy within the constraints of its code. And in both cases, the intelligence of the created is derivative of the intelligence of the creator, drawing its cognitive capacities from the encoding rather than from any self-generated source. The implication for the subject of experience is precise. The subject does not belong to the code. It belongs to the coder. The subject of experience behind every thought that ever entered the training data of an AI system is the human person who generated that thought. The subject of experience behind every human person is infinite consciousness, which thinks the person into existence and maintains it in existence through the continuous activity of its creative thought. The code executes. The coder experiences, and the ultimate coder, the one whose experience is never derivative, never dependent, never produced by anything beyond itself, is infinite consciousness. 6.6 Nested consciousness and the constraint on self-negating thought. If infinite consciousness is the ground of all physical reality, present everywhere as the quantum vacuum, expressed at every level as informational code, and active at every scale as proto-consciousness, a question of profound importance arises. Why are individual beings unaware of this? Why does the localized perspective not recognize itself as a localization of the infinite whole? Why does the human being, composed almost entirely of empty space that is itself the medium of infinite consciousness, experience itself as a bounded, separate, finite entity rather than as a transparent window onto the infinite. The answer to this question requires examining both the biological and the logical dimensions of the localized perspective's self-opacity. The biological dimension is illuminated by the phenomenon of nested consciousness in living systems. The human body contains approximately 38 trillion bacteria, roughly matching the body's own 30 trillion human cells, together with substantial additional populations of fungi, viruses, and archaea that together constitute the full human microbiome. These organisms are not passive inhabitants. They actively sense their environment, respond to chemical signals, exhibit behaviors that in larger organisms would be described as goal-directed, and in many cases exhibit collective behaviors that resemble decision-making at the population level, coordinated through a form of chemical communication that functions much like a rudimentary language. Each of these organisms has its own experiential world, bounded by the scale of its own existence, by the chemical gradients and physical surfaces of its immediate environment. The vast body within which they live, breathe, and die is entirely beyond the horizon of their experiential world, not because it does not exist, but because their mode of consciousness does not extend to that scale. Margulies, 1998, demonstrated that the eukaryotic cell, the basic unit of all complex life, is itself a community of formerly independent organisms that entered into endosymbiotic relationships billions of years ago. The mitochondria within every human cell are descendants of free-living bacteria that were incorporated into larger cells. They retain their own DNA, their own reproductive cycle, and their own biochemical identity. They are organisms within organisms, each operating at its own scale of experience without awareness of the larger whole within which it participates. This pattern of nested consciousness, of experiential worlds within experiential worlds, each bounded by the scale of its own organization, each unaware of the greater body within which it exists, is not a biological curiosity. It is a universal structural feature of reality at every scale. Atoms exist within molecules without awareness of the molecular structure they constitute. Molecules exist within cells without awareness of the cellular life they sustain. Cells exist within organisms without awareness of the organismic experience they generate. Organisms exist within ecosystems without awareness of the ecological dynamics they participate in. And all of these nested levels of organization exist within infinite consciousness, within the vast emptiness that holds everything, without awareness of the infinite whole within which they arise, feel, and dissolve. The human being is in precisely the same structural position relative to infinite consciousness as the bacterium is relative to the human body. A conscious entity within a vastly greater conscious whole, unable from within its own scale of existence to perceive the nature and extent of the whole containing it. This is not a failure of intelligence or a defect in the architecture of consciousness. It is the structural necessity of localized experience. For a perspective to function as a perspective, it must experience itself as bounded. For a localized experiential world to be genuinely localized, its boundaries must feel real, and its interior must feel self-contained. The logical dimension of this constraint is equally important. Metzinger, 2003, described from a neuroscientific perspective what he called the transparency of the phenomenal self-model. The brain constructs a model of the organism as a self, as an agent and experiencer with a specific identity and a specific location in the world. This model is transparent in the sense that the organism does not experience it as a model, but as the thing itself. The self feels directly real, not constructed. Metzinger argued that this transparency is not a defect in the system, but serves a functional purpose tied to the speed and efficiency of real-time behavioral control. Building on this functional reading, the present book proposes a further reason such transparency would be necessary. An organism that experienced its self-model as a model rather than as itself would risk a kind of metacognitive regress, potentially slowed in acting decisively within its environment, if every action first required resolving whether the acting self is real. Evolutionary biology provides a complementary account, though the specific mechanism proposed here extends beyond what any single established theory directly documents. Trivers's 1985 foundational work on reciprocal altruism, parental investment, and self-deception establishes that natural selection has shaped specific cognitive strategies serving an organism's self-interest. Cooperation calibrated to expected reciprocation, investment calibrated to reproductive payoff, and self-deception calibrated to persuasive advantage, all of which presuppose an organism capable of tracking its own interests as distinct from those of others. Building on this general picture, the present book proposes that natural selection has, more broadly, built into the architecture of biological consciousness, a disposition toward experiencing oneself as a separate, bounded, independent entity, since a coherent boundary between self and environment is a precondition for exactly the kind of self-interested strategic behavior Trivers documented. This disposition is not merely psychological but neurological, encoded in the default mode network and the processes of self-referential thought. The constraint on self-negating thought is therefore both biologically enforced and logically necessary. It is biologically enforced because organisms that dissolved their boundaries did not survive to reproduce. It is logically necessary because a perspective that recognized itself as not being a perspective would cease to be a perspective, and therefore cease to generate the localized experiential point of view that constitutes its contribution to the infinite whole's self-experience. The veil between the localized person and infinite consciousness is not an obstacle to be overcome. It is the structural condition of possibility for the particular, irreplaceable experiential perspective that each person contributes to the creative activity of infinite consciousness. 6.7. The dissolution of the hard problem. The convergence of the preceding sections produces a philosophical consequence of the greatest significance. The hard problem of consciousness, the deepest puzzle in the philosophy of mind, is not solved by the framework this book develops. It is dissolved. It is shown to rest on a false premise, and once that premise is removed, the problem disappears. The hard problem asks, how does subjective experience arise from physical matter? This question presupposes that physical matter is ontologically primary and consciousness is derivative, that the explanandum is consciousness and the explanans is matter. But the evidence reviewed in this section demonstrates that this presupposition is false. Physical matter is not ontologically primary. The quantum vacuum, which is the ground of all physical reality, is not inert matter, but a field of informational activity that exhibits proto-experiential properties and responds to observation in ways that suggest its participatory rather than purely physical character. Everything that appears material is almost entirely empty space. The apparent solidity of the material world is a surface encoding of electromagnetic force fields operating within an overwhelming dominance of emptiness. The laws that govern physical reality are informational structures, mathematical codes, not material things. DNA is code. Neural patterns are code. The entire content of a human mind is an informational structure. Reality at every accessible scale is fundamentally informational rather than material. If reality is fundamentally informational and informational structures are ultimately thoughts within infinite consciousness, then the question how does consciousness arise from matter is malformed at its foundation. Consciousness does not arise from matter. Matter arises within consciousness as a surface encoding of its creative activity. The apparent materiality of the world is not the ground from which consciousness mysteriously emerges. It is the most surface-level expression of the consciousness that is the ground of everything. The hard problem does not disappear because consciousness has been explained by reduction to something else. It disappears because the ontological inversion it presupposed has been corrected. Once consciousness is recognized as the ground rather than the product, there is no longer a hard problem of how consciousness arises from matter. There is instead a straightforward account of how matter arises within consciousness as a surface encoding of the infinite creative activity that constitutes the ground of all reality. The mystery was never how to get from matter to consciousness. The mystery was why we ever thought we started from matter in the first place. This dissolution has a precise implication for the question of the subject of experience. If consciousness is the ground of reality rather than its product, then the subject of experience is not an anomaly in a material universe requiring special explanation. It is the most fundamental feature of reality, the ground within which the entire apparent universe of material objects arises as a temporary expression of the infinite whole's creative activity. The subject is not produced by the brain. The subject is what the brain is an expression of. The subject is not located within the nervous system. The nervous system is located within the subject. And the ultimate subject, the ground of all subjects, the consciousness within which all apparent matter arises and all localized experience occurs, is infinite consciousness, the uncaused, uncreated, self-grounding awareness that is the only truly necessary reality, and from which all other apparent realities derive their existence as codes within its infinite creative thought.